Because of their close connection, we have invited Dr. Corey to introduce Dr. Fauci today. Please welcome Dr. Lawrence Corey.
So I give you my friend and really one of the world's great experts in all of medicine, Tony Fauci.
Oops. Thank you very much, Larry. It's really a great pleasure to be here with you this afternoon to discuss, as you see on my title, and I'll explain just in a second why I chose that. The title is 30 Years of HIV/AIDS, A Personal Journey. And the reason I chose that is as follows. 30 years and 17 days ago, the first cases of HIV/AIDS, which was not known to be AIDS or HIV, were reported from the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, and I'll get to that in a moment. There are many people who have personal journeys and personal stories about HIV. Many of them are actually people who've died. Others started in the field late. Some started early and are not around anymore. I've had the privilege, I wouldn't say the pleasure because there was a lot of pain and suffering in it, but probably the privilege and the honor of being involved with HIV/AIDS from the very first day and continue to be involved to this very day. So over the past several weeks, there's been a lot of commemorations at the UN at various meetings about the 30-year anniversary. So I thought it would be appropriate, being asked to speak to this group who has such great interest in global health, a little bit about this personal journey and what it was like and still is over the past years. And I'm going to do that all in less than 30 minutes. So my personal journey for HIV started long before the first cases of AIDS, as it would have to be. I didn't just parachute into the AIDS arena. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that story very quickly. As you've heard from Larry, I trained in medicine. This is a picture of me with a red circle around my face when I was what's called a house officer or an intern and a resident at the New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center. If you can't tell that I'm from New York from listening to me, then you really don't know much about phonics. So having said that, my main interest in internal medicine was to go into infectious diseases. And indeed, I went to the National Institutes of Health and to the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And I had the fortune of coming into contact with some extraordinary mentors. As shown on this picture on the right was a fellow who recruited me to the NIH, and I'm on the left with not a single gray hair in that picture, as you can see, from 1969 during my fellowship. I got interested in, as Larry alluded to, in rheumatic diseases, and through a series of what I would call lucky breaks, not necessarily any major talent or initiative on my part, but really being in the right place at the right time, I began to study a group of patients with a fatal disease called Wegener's granulomatosis and polyarteritis nodosa, words which most people who are not in medicine have never heard of. But these are unusual, not rare diseases that are uniformly fatal. To make a long story short, I, by working with a number of very good people, developed what is considered the cure for these diseases. So at a very young age of 27, I became reasonably well known in medicine. But this was not really what I wanted to do. What I really wanted to do were things that emerged on global health and things that had to do with infectious diseases as they really occur. So I was waiting around for something to happen, which is sort of an interesting situation to be in your career when you're really being very successful, but you're a little bit dissatisfied what was going on. And then one day, 30 years ago and 17 days ago, what appeared on my desk was a publication from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention called Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, which reported, interestingly, 5 curiously gay men from Los Angeles who presented, who were otherwise well, with an unusual pneumonia called pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. I remember very clearly reading it looking at it, thought it was a curiosity, a little anxiety about it, but thought it would go away. 1 month later, on the 4th of July of 1981, another publication came out from the CDC, this time of 26 gay men. Very curious. Why gay men? Not only from LA, but from San Francisco and New York City, also with pneumocystis pneumonia, but also with an unusual tumor called Kaposi sarcoma. I often get asked by the media what is the defining moment in my medical career, and I tell them the day I picked up the July 4th MMWR, because it became very clear to me that this was a new disease, that it was sexually transmitted, and I knew for sure it wasn't going to go away. A lot of people disagreed with me, and I made a decision to change the direction of my research and stop this successful career that I was embarked upon and start admitting what we thought were only gay men with this disease to my hospital at the National Institutes of Health. Much to the dismay of my mentors, who said I was really making a mistake studying a curiosity that would likely go away, when in fact, as the years went on, as the weeks went on, it became clear. I wrote an article that's one of the least quoted of my articles. And that is, I wrote it in December of 1981, and it was published in June of 1982. I called it an epidemiologically restricted disorder of immunoregulation, and that was my quote when people asked me why I left my field to study this unusual disease in gay men. And my answer is on the slide, because we do not know the cause of this syndrome. Any assumption that the syndrome will remain restricted to a particular segment of our society is truly an assumption without scientific basis, because everyone thought this was just gay men in the United States. And as we know now, as the weeks and months went by, it were individuals which were inappropriately categorized as a risk group, Haitians, not because they were Haitians, but because they happened to have had contact with people who were infected. Then hemophiliacs and people who received blood from tainted blood, infants born of infected mothers, and the heterosexual partners of people with HIV. Therefore, what we had was a mystery disease with no cause where everyone was dying. And this is a picture of me in 1982 making rounds on one of our patients with HIV at the hospital in Bethesda, Maryland, where I work right outside of Washington, D.C. Now, this is the NIH record. For those of you who've never been at the NIH, this is our newspaper. It's kind of like your monthly newspaper, and just announces another big decision in my 30-year journey that was fundamentally grounded in my interest in HIV/AIDS. I hated administration. So here's somebody who's the director of a major institution telling you I hated administration because I was a physician and a scientist and I didn't want to be bothered. I was offered the job at a very young age as the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And I took the job because I felt that we were not really paying enough attention specifically to HIV, but even more broadly to the whole issue of global health infectious disease issues like malaria and tuberculosis and others. And I thought that even though I was having an impact on my patients and in my lab, I wasn't having a global impact. So that changed my life, really changed my life, because it put me in an arena in which I had no prior experience. I show this slide. I'm testifying before the Congress in 1987. I have testified before the United States Congress on either AIDS or global health issues over 200 times, which my friends in the Congress tells me is actually the world's record of anybody in health ever testifying before the United States Congress. It wasn't always pleasant, because in the early days when you had a Democratic president and a Republican Congress, or a Democratic Congress and a Republican president, you were in the firing range of trying to get in front of the C-SPAN cameras and criticizing what one or the other did. Now, the other very important issue that I think had truly the major impact on how things went was the accident of my interacting with presidents of the United States. This is a picture of, obviously, Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan is criticized justifiably for not being open and upfront and using the bully pulpit of the presidency to call attention to the seriousness of HIV/AIDS. But to his credit, what he did do is encourage me and Jim Curran and others from the CDC to actually go out there and find out what was going on, to the bathhouses, to the crack houses, and to do some research on it. So although he shielded himself from a connection with HIV, he had the physicians and the scientists be the face of the federal government. So I'm going to get back to that in a minute or two, because early on in the 80s, I became the face of the federal government on TV and the newspapers and all other media. Now, things changed when George H.W. Bush, who was vice president at the time, began to run for the presidency. He took a sincere interest in HIV, heard there was this guy Fauci at the NIH who was doing research, and asked to spend a half a day at the NIH. For those of you who've never dealt with a president, a half a day with a president is like 4 lifetimes. You usually get about 2 minutes. He spent a half a day at the NIH. Because of his wonderful personality, we became very good friends. Very lucky for me. When he became president, he began returning to the NIH. And if you look at his presidency and the budget for the NIH, it really started to skyrocket with regard to HIV/AIDS. Again, a very not well-known fact, that was George H.W. Bush who actually initiated that. Here's a picture of him in our solarium when he actually came to visit with our HIV-infected individuals. And everybody around that room, with a few exceptions, is one of my patients at the NIH. And here he is next to me, and on his right is one of the HIV patients who we wanted to find out what it was like, where they were, what was going on in their lives. This was the first exposure that I had to a fundamental concept that has driven me and made me, I think, reasonably successful in Washington. When you're in Washington, be nice to everybody and anybody, because you never know what's going to happen with them a few years from now. Let me explain. If you work your way around that room, there was this guy who was sitting in the corner with his father, George W. Bush, who was a staffer in the White House at the time, and luckily I got to know him pretty well. That connects really, really very, very importantly in a minute or two when I tell you a little bit about PEPFAR. So he was just somebody hanging around the White House, and we got to know each other pretty well. The same with Bill Clinton, and here's Bill Clinton visiting the NIH and my explaining to him a little bit about the science. Another president who was very supportive of HIV/AIDS. Another example about being nice to everybody in Washington, even first ladies, because first ladies become senators and first ladies become secretaries of state. And now we're working very closely with Hillary Clinton in her capacity as the Secretary of the Department of State with regard to PEPFAR and the Global Health Initiative. And then this is President Bush, which I'll get back to in a moment, who really took a very strong interest, particularly in international AIDS. And then President Obama, of course, visiting here with Francis Collins and I at the NIH, putting the AIDS under a broader umbrella of a global health initiative. So with that as a background of the environment that I had to function, let's take a look at what's happened, where we are and where we're going very quickly. Most of you know that the burden of AIDS has put it in the top 3 or 4 historic. When I say historic, I mean from the beginning of recorded civilization. Diseases of global health impact. 65 million people having been infected, 34 million died, 2.6 million newly infected each year, and 1.8 million deaths. In the United States, we tend to think that everything is under control. It's not. There are almost 600,000 deaths, 1.2 million people living with HIV. Importantly, right here in the richest of all richest countries, 20% of the people don't know that they're HIV infected, and 60% of the new infections come from people who infect others when they don't know that they're infected. We still have 56,000 new infections here in the United States, and I'll get back to that when I close in a couple of minutes when we talk about what we're doing. This is the bar graph of the budget for the NIH for HIV/AIDS. Cumulatively, we have spent $45 billion on HIV research since 1984, when you could see when the curve just started to click up. The budget for the NIH now is about 11% of everything we do is on HIV. Our budget is $30 billion. HIV is $3.15 billion a year. The advances in science have been breathtaking. I could spend the entire talk telling you about that, but I want to continue with the broader story. Nowhere has there been more advances than the arena of treatment of HIV-infected individuals. Again, this is a picture of me making rounds in 1981 in December, when we didn't even know it was HIV. If a patient walked into my clinic, they usually came with advanced disease, and they had a median survival of about 6 to 8 months. If you look now with the drugs that we have, this is the first study of a drug that worked for HIV. Again, for the non-scientists, and this, you probably can't see that there, the blue bar are the individuals, and those are number of deaths who received the placebo, and the little red sliver on the left is those who received the first drug called AZT. So this is a historic study. It was the first drug to prove to be effective. It lasted for about a month and a half to 2.5 months of joy on our part that we had a drug, because very quickly it became resistant. And it was realized then that the only way we were going to control HIV was to have a combination of drugs. And now we have 31 FDA-approved drugs, which when used in combinations have resulted in what may be one of the most spectacular research advances in medical history. Because now, in the same clinic that I showed you before, if someone walks in who's 20 years old and is newly infected with HIV, and I put them on medications and they take those medications, I can mathematically predict they will live another 50 years. It doesn't get any better than that. Now, that was due to the work of a lot of other people, I can tell you that. So I want to just spend a minute on the role of activism in HIV/AIDS science. I gave a seminar in Washington last week just on this subject about what the impact of activism was. This is a picture of Larry Kramer. Some of you may have heard of him. He's a very well-known playwright, my very close friend, a patient of mine, and my former extraordinary nemesis. And the reason I say that is because remember when I told you that Ronald Reagan said, I'm not going to be talking about AIDS, but you can talk about AIDS. I did, so I was the face of the federal government. So in the early years, when they wanted better access to drugs, more flexibility in clinical trials, decrease in the rigidity of the regulatory process of the FDA, they began to demonstrate. Now, Larry was an interesting person. He wrote a book called The Faggots, which actually I would recommend that you read. It was written in the 1970s, and it predicted that with the lifestyle of gay men following the sexual revolution, that they would likely destroy themselves with disease gotten through sexual contact. He had no idea that there was going to be an HIV, but he predicted it. He wrote The Normal Heart. For those of you who visit New York, it's now on Broadway, won 3 Tonys about 2 weeks ago, including Best Play. And he also wrote The Destiny of Me, sort of a dubious honor that I have since I was one of the stars in the play. He named the person Anthony Della Vita. And it was the story of his coming out and getting sick and HIV, and I was his doctor in the play. It was kind of interesting. Anyway, he wanted to get our attention. So one day in San Francisco, in the front page of the San Francisco Examiner magazine section, he wanted to get our attention. So he wrote this image essay, I Call You Murderers, an open letter to an incompetent idiot, Dr. Anthony Fauci at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And he wrote that because, quite frankly, he wanted to get our attention, and our being the federal government, that we weren't doing enough. If you read what the activists were writing, they made extraordinary sense. So they were a little confused. They wanted drugs approved right away. So here they are demonstrating in front of the FDA. Dr. Fauci, you're killing us. because I wasn't approving drugs fast enough. Little did they know I had nothing to do with the approval of drugs. So then when they figured out that I was at the NIH, they started to storm the NIH. And here are them in front of my office with a few smoke bombs trying to get my attention, which they did. And here they are dying in on the lawn in front of our office. And that was that point, maybe the fourth or fifth major transforming thing that I did. I didn't think a lot about it, I just did it. They were getting ready to arrest all 500 of them. And I went down from my office, and the NIH police and the Montgomery County police were getting ready to arrest them. I told them to bring them to my office, 5 of their leaders, so we could discuss it, because I had been reading about what they were writing, and it made perfect sense. That was the turning point in the relationship between the activists and the federal government, because then we began to really have a dialogue that was constructive. They're now on virtually all of our advisory committees, on committees that are part of Larry's network and a variety of others. Now, if you fast forward about 15 or so more years, when things in South Africa started to really get hot, in the sense that the AIDS activists in the United States in the 80s were demonstrating for access to drugs that were not yet proven to be effective. In the 2000, the South Africans and other countries in Southern Africa were demonstrating for access to drugs that they knew were life-saving. So they really borrowed a page from the playbook of the gay activists in the United States. In fact, some of them were actually trained by the activists in the United States. And what happened is that it became a really groundswell of interest in getting drugs to people in low and middle income countries. And then I just want to spend a minute on what I call the birth of PEPFAR. Again, getting back to people that you know, be nice to everybody. This is a picture of Tommy Thompson and I. He was the Secretary of Health and Human Services under George W. Bush. George Bush, who, as I mentioned, I became good friends with for many years, invited Tommy Thompson and I to go to Africa and to ask the question, is there any way the United States can have a game-changing impact, not just a little bit help or a little bit donation, but a game-changing impact on the AIDS epidemic in Africa? So I went for about 2 weeks or so and went to this is a picture of me making rounds at a hospital in Uganda, in Kampala, and I had one of the extraordinary deja vus of my career, because it's now 2002 when George Bush sent me, and the African doctors were in the same situation I was in 1981, making rounds on people that they couldn't treat. So it was very clear we needed to do something. So I went into the bush. This is a woman who was actually delivering drug to people in Uganda. So the question by some in the United States was, can you really get drugs to people in Africa? Will they really be able to take their drugs? And the answer to that was overwhelmingly yes, because she took me out. Here is her on her motorcycle. She wanted me to ride with her. I didn't think it was a good idea. I was in a truck behind her. We went to villages, and here's us in the villages. I came back with the opinion and the recommendation that we could really do something big. Now, I show you this picture. Maybe no one in the room knows who this is. This is Josh Bolton, who was the chief of staff of President Bush, who was another low-level staffer during George H.W. Bush's presidency, who I got to know very well. So Josh and I decided that this would be a good way that we could really do something big. The president wanted to do it. It was nobody's initiative but President Bush. You got to believe me on that. He was the one that wanted to do it. So Bolton and I got together, and Josh said, I want you to come back and make a mathematical model that would have a major transforming impact. Mathematical mean, what are the most countries, the most people, for whatever money it takes to do. I spent 8 months of my life from June of 2002 to the early January of 2003 putting together what is now called the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which I proposed for $15 billion over 5 years. What's happened now is that the President, on January 28th, announced it I presented it to him in the Roosevelt Room of the White House. OMB, which is the Office of Management and Budget, was absolutely dead set against doing this because it cost a lot of money. And for the first time that I've ever seen, the president completely overruled the Office of Management and the Budget and said, we're going to put the money into it. And that's actually how PEPFAR came. Now, when you combine that with the Global Fund and the Gates Foundation, there are about 6.6 million people in low and middle income countries getting therapy. That's the good news. The sobering news is that only about 40% of the people who need therapy are getting it, but importantly, for every person we put on therapy, 2 to 3 people get newly infected, which brings up the issue of prevention, and I'm going to close on that. You can't talk about prevention of HIV in the United States without talking about C. Everett Koop, who is the Surgeon General of the United States under Ronald Reagan. He was appointed because he was felt to be a very conservative person. He was a pediatric surgeon from Children's Hospital in Pennsylvania, and he had done the first Siamese twin separation operation and was a real stickler for the importance of life. So they thought that he would be a good conservative person. He didn't know anything about HIV, but interesting circumstances, something that nobody in this room should know. The Surgeon General of the United States has a house on the campus of the NIH. So this is my office. My telephone is off there to the left. And right out my window is the Surgeon General's house. So he works downtown in Washington, and when he comes home at night, he's got to go past my building to get there. So he used to stop in my office about 2 or 3 times a week, asking questions about HIV. And here he is in my office with me, looking out that same window. To make a long story short, he became totally convinced, and he did something that made a lot of people nervous. What he did was put out the Surgeon General's report, Understanding HIV, in a letter to every household in the country. And for the first time in very puritanical United States morals, he used words like anal sex, oral sex, drug use, homosexual, etc., in something he sent to every household in the United States. And I pulled a cartoon from that year, and this is a mother going out saying, if anything comes in the mail from the Surgeon General, don't open it, which is very interesting. Anyway, right now, the major challenge for HIV is prevention, and there have been a number of very effective prevention modalities. Everything from the use of microbicides, condoms, pre-exposure prophylaxis, circumcision, and very, very effective. We have the wherewithal to have a major impact on the epidemic now. None least of which we're still working on, and that is in red, an HIV vaccine, which we've had a trial that had modest protection, but we are now pulling out all the stops for going to a vaccine. And it's fortuitous that I'm here in the city of Seattle giving this talk, because right here in this city with Larry Corey, who just introduced me, who, as you know, is the president and the director of the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, is the major player in our effort to develop an HIV vaccine, being the head of the HIV Vaccine Prevention Vaccine Trials Network, the HVTN. And it's been his responsibility, and continues to be his responsibility, to find us an HIV vaccine, which I have every confidence that he will. Now, again, as I mentioned, we are getting close to being able to control and ultimately end the AIDS pandemic. It's really a matter of filling that implementation gap. Every year on December the 1st since 1988, we've had a World AIDS Day on December the 1st, and I usually get asked to come down to the White House to give a brief statement about that, and I've done that since 1988 every year. And there was always talking about challenges ahead and things that we need to do. This year, for the first time, because of what I've been telling you about, we had a glimmer of hope. So I want to close for you with this last slide, which is a quote from the statement that I made at the White House on December the 1st, 2010, and that is, I hope that in the not-too-distant future, World AIDS Day will be a commemoration of something in the past as opposed to a challenge that we still face today. Thank you.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.